attitudes, beliefs and values. Jesus often used the family. This is one instance. Once there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the property that will come to me." So he decided to divide up his property between the 2 of them. Before very long, the younger son collected all his belongings and went off to a foreign land, where he squandered his wealth in the wildest extravagance. And when he had run through all his money, a terrible famine arose in that country, and he began to feel the pinch. Then he went and hired himself to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him out into the fields to feed the swine. He got to the point of longing to stuff himself with the food the pigs were eating, and not a soul gave him anything. Then he came to his senses and said aloud, "Why, dozens of my father's hired men have got more food than they can eat, and here am I dying of hunger. I will get up and go back to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have done wrong in the sight of heaven and in your eyes. I don't deserve to be called your son anymore. Please take me on as one of your hired men.' But while he was still some distance off, his father saw him, and his heart went out to him, and he ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. But his son said, 'Father, I have done wrong in the sight of heaven and in your eyes. I don't deserve to be called your son anymore.' 'Hurry!' called the father to the servants. 'Bring the best clothes and put them on him. Put a ring in his finger and shoes on his feet, and get that calf refattened and kill it, and we will have a feast and a celebration. For this is my son. I thought he was dead, and he's alive again. I thought we had lost him, and he's found.' And they began to get the festivities going. But the elder son was out in the fields, and as he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants across to him and inquired what was the meaning of it all. 'Your brother has arrived, and your father has killed the calf we fattened, because he has got him home again, safe and sound,' was the reply. But he was furious and refused to go inside the house. So his father came outside and called him. Then he burst out, 'Look, how many years have I slaved for you and never disobeyed a single order of yours, and yet you've never given me so much as a young goat so that I could give my friends a dinner. But when that son of yours arrives, who has spent all your money on prostitutes, you kill the calf we've fattened.' But the father replied, 'My dear son, you have been with me all the time. Everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and show your joy, for this is your brother. I thought he was dead, and he's alive. I thought he was lost, and he is found.' This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Jack. Next Sunday, pardon me, we're talking about staying for soup and rolls. What we'd like to do is just get an indication of how many people will not be able to stay. Can you just? Oh, well, you won't be here. Okay. So it looks like the majority will be able to stay. And the other thing that we're interested in is I would like Marge to help me with a small group running, or try and run a few groups in the room. And we need someone just sort of to help in the kitchen with washing up and stuff like that. Do I see your hand? No. What I'd like you to do is to go and talk to Marge afterwards, if you can help in that way. That would be really, really great. Well, it's a very familiar story, isn't it? And probably the most familiar story, but guys, don't worry about the overheads, we'll get by. Good. It was a very familiar story, and it's interesting that film clip you showed, Lorraine. We didn't know what happened next. And exactly the same with this story. We're not really sure what happens next. And when we start thinking about this story, it's probably the most famous story in the Bible. And I just checked that I'm on. Yep, I'm on. And the most famous story in the Bible, and the word prodigal is part of our English language. When someone comes home after being away for a while, we call it the prodigal. And so we're very, very familiar with this story. But when we start to preach about it, I think of a time I was in Minneapolis where they had a whole series just based on this Bible passage. Week after week, just talking about the prodigal son. Now, I don't think it's been intended to be analysed verse by verse. I think the story is supposed to have an impact, that we hear it and we just grasp what is the central theme of this story. Well, we've got the youngest son, immature, sort of wanting it to instant gratification, and we see a typical picture there in biblical times, and we see it today. How many times do we switch on the news and we read the story of youth killing themselves? How many times do we read of a youth jumping in a car, roaring down the street and wrapping themselves around a gum tree or something like that? And even a 14-year-old girl killed herself this week, and the mother described her as her little angel. Perhaps she was a little angel some of the time. And I did some research into young adults many years ago as part of studies, and discovered that the 18 to 25 group doesn't really quite get there until they get married. And then they start to think of the other person, they start to think a bit more maturely. But at that point, they're just thinking of what pleases me and what suits me and what will work for me at this particular time. You think about it. You think about what the immature mind does. We'll drive 160, whoa, down the road we go. And then a few weeks later, the funeral. Or let's spend $50 on those little pills we can buy at the music festival and don't think about the brain damage. Let's have fun tonight. Let's have a sexual encounter that's a one-night stand and not think of the internal consequences of pregnancy. And not only do we behave in an immature way, it's our attitude to other people. About 40 years ago, Scripture Union put out a little, I suppose you call it an audio visual. They called it Number One. Do you remember that one, Lorraine? Yeah. Number One was a guy who grew up right through his life, and he wasn't surrounded by people, he was surrounded by blobs. He didn't see them as people. And these blobs looked after every need he had. And he was, if you like, a maverick, if you like. He was a person who just saw his own needs and didn't see the needs of other people. And he married a blob as well, not referring to her as a blob as such, but that's how he saw it. His wife was there to look after you. You married a blob too? Okay. I saw that. And his wife was there to look after his own needs. And then, in the story, another blob becomes closer. There's a little crisis in his life. And another blob comes closer and closer and closer. And as he sees through this crisis, he sees the blob is actually in the shape of the cross. And as he looks closer, he sees Jesus on the cross. And it's a turning point for him as he realises, as he sees Jesus, he starts to see other people. the young adult doesn't always see that. I've got a relative who talks about her father as being the great banker, a source of income. And this is how this guy saw his father, as a source of income. And when he comes in, and when he asks for his inheritance, he's really saying to Dad, you are as good as dead. I want my money now as if you are dead. And some of us have heard our grandchildren talking about when you're going, Dad, so we can get our inheritance. And we laugh about it, but it hurts a little bit. And here is, if you like, a young man trying to extract all he can from the relationship. Now, we need forgiveness for the times that we just treat people as blobs. We need forgiveness for the time that we want to extract as much as we can from other people without thinking of our own need. And if you like, there are two extremes. There's a person who's like that, and there's also the person who's super sensitive to other needs and tries to please everybody. And those of you who have been in ministry know that that's impossible. But the major factor with the young adult is the fact that they are extracting. Many of them are just extracting from what they can from other people. Now, in marriages, I don't think of marriages. You talk to your wife about talk to your wife being a blob. Men are more guilty of it than women. Right? Sorry, guys, to let you down, but generally, men are sort of trying to extract more from a relationship and less inclined to give. And I always tell Marge that she's lucky to have married a sensitive, new age guy. She doesn't agree, but it doesn't matter. Now, it's not only insensitivity that's happening at this particular point, it's also rejection of his father's values. He goes to a far country. Remember the Jewish attitude at this time to people who are Gentiles, and he squanders his money and ends up in the pigsty. His father would have been brought up with the idea that you work to have what you have. This guy squandered his money. Pigs, you know the Jewish attitude towards pigs. And if you like, it's a complete rejection of everything his father stands for. And he squandered, we didn't know it beforehand until the older brother spoke up, he squandered his money on prostitutes. Now, I read a book many years ago by a guy called Rollo May. And he was writing in the swinging 60s. And he's writing to the fact that people just slept around, sort of using other people for their sexual gratification. And he said that type of value just ended nowhere. The type of hedonism just uses other people doesn't end up in very satisfactory. And he said your greatest purpose is to discover what you can do for other people. This young man didn't understand that. Now, let me say to the old people in the congregation, who are the old people, those of you who are 83, let me say to you that you don't let your world shrink. One of the things that I've discovered about ageing is that sometimes you start to focus on your own needs and you start to forget about the bigger world. Don't do that. Don't do that. As we age, let's grow younger and let's be aware of what's happening in the world and how there are some marvellous people serving us and we need to be serving others. It doesn't stop just because we are getting older. Now, as we discovered, this guy had a higher cause, and his higher cause was himself, but it didn't lead anywhere. Listen to verse 14. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. He would have gladly filled himself with the pods the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. The ultimate rejection of his father's values. Quite interesting. We grew up in South Melbourne as a boy, and my first ministry was in South Melbourne, and the South Melbourne church was my first experience of ministry, and naturally I barracked for South Melbourne. And I grew up, my first son was brought up to be a barracker for South Melbourne. and he was wheeled off to the market with his little South Melbourne jumper on, Sydney Swans today, and he formed a friendship with a young guy who barracked for Collingwood. And Tim came home one day and said, "Dad, because South Melbourne always loses and Collingwood always wins, I'm going to barrack for Collingwood." I couldn't think of a more ultimate rejection of my values. And when we see this is what's happening here. And today we see sometimes a reversal of that. There are a lot of young adults these days saying, perhaps home's not a bad place after all. And I told you last week about how one of our kids moved out and then moved back again because she found it too expensive and she needed someone to replace the toilet paper and all that type of thing. This guy found that suffering was a great teacher. And through his suffering, he came to his own senses. And he needed to work his way through it. He was Jewish. I need to go back to my father, and I need to say to him, "Father, I've sinned against you and against heaven, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired servants." And that is a very Jewish path to restitution. Now, the bottom of the J curve, feeding pigs. As we reflect on life, and I think I'm speaking on behalf of a few of you here, there have been moments when we've been down there. It might have been a medical condition, it might have been a mental condition, it might have been a marriage problem, it might have been some form of illness. And when we go through that experience, our self-esteem is on very shaky ground. And we need to come up and we need to understand that we're not going to be there forever. And that is your testimony. As you think back through life, you say, yeah, God rescued me at that particular point. And there's a long walk that occurs, the long walk back home. And that son is expecting a stony silence. He wasn't expecting the door to be open. He wasn't expecting the light to be on. He was expecting a stony silence. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." Okay, Lorraine introduced us to the feelings of the father. And when we see that, we see the feeling of powerful rejection that he must have felt. And again, talking about my own son, we used to play cricket in the backyard, and backyard cricket. And then one day, wearing his Collingwood jumper, he said to me, "Dad, I prefer to play with the other kids." Oh, okay. Rejection. We've all been through that when the peer group pressure starts to play. And what about the time when the teenagers don't want to stay with grandma and grandpa anymore? You'll experience that, and it's another form of rejection. But we've also mentioned the fact that there's been a rejection of the value system. And here's a guy who's used to hard work, seeing his son squandering his money away. And if we project ourselves into the feelings of the father, perhaps there is disappointment, perhaps there's rejection, perhaps there's a little bit of anger, and then waiting for the boy to come home. And while he's waiting for the boy to come home, the farm is being neglected. Other important things aren't being done. There was nothing more important than the fact that his son was lost. Leighton Ford, the son-in-law of Billy Graham, was a Presbyterian minister. And Leighton Ford, Saturday night, he shouldn't be doing it on Saturday night, but he's preparing his sermon for the next day. And then he discovered, the news came that his 8-year-old boy was missing. He was eventually found. But at that moment, Leighton Ford says, the sermon was not important. The only important thing was to find my son. Think of that as a church. I often read through church minutes of various congregations, and there's more concern about the property than what there is about the son. And when we start seeing that, we start to see that our concerns can be in the wrong place. Now, see this father, pardon me, see him running towards his son as he comes down. See him running, and going back to the culture of the time, pardon me, it was wrong for a father to run. because if you run, you had to pull up your robe and show your legs. And that's why it's a good idea for you old guys not to be wearing shorts. Thanks very much for coming in long trousers. And in that time, they didn't show their legs, and he doesn't care. This is most important, that he greets his son. And the son starts off with the speech. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. And he stops him. Robe, ring, symbols of authority, symbols of welcome back home, symbols of elevation, the symbols of forgiveness, and they're placed upon his finger and upon his back. Now, one wants to speak about Jewish restitution, and the other one wants to speak about grace. There's an important question we need to ask before we go any further. Who is listening to this story? Go back to verses 1 and 2 of chapter 15 and you get the answer. Listen to this, very interesting. Now all tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, this fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. Hear that? Tax collectors, sinners, Jesus is mixing with them. And the story is in the context of an answer to that question. Should Jesus be mixing outside his own circle? And I think the answer is, I have come for the sake of the younger son, and I welcome him. Oh, the third character, Mr. Grump. Mr. Grump, the older son, is standing in the paddock. And he hears all the noise, he hears the festivities, and he smells the barbecue, and everybody's happy. Everybody's happy, except the younger son, and perhaps the fatted calf isn't too happy either. Now, like the Pharisees who've been listening to this story, the older son has been loyal. The older son is a typical, if you like, older person. I don't know if you believe in birth order, but usually the oldest in the family is responsible, careful, and sometimes look down their nose at the younger ones who are more irresponsible. How does that apply in your family? Yeah, okay. And when you see this, you see that the Pharisees are placed under a judgment. They couldn't understand grace. They couldn't understand the Father's heart. And the younger son didn't understand it. Father, I have sinned against heaven. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And nor did the older son understand the Father's heart either. And they both stood on common ground. But the younger son discovered what the Father's heart was all about. Often I hear churches being described as being guilty of the elder son syndrome. Many years ago, when we were at Wollongong, I was called over to Canberra as a consultant. It's easy to be a consultant. You can tell people what to do and then get out of the place. And it was a Baptist church, but it wasn't a normal Baptist church. It was Canberra Baptist Church. I hope nobody knows anybody from the Canberra Baptist Church. It was very liturgical. And they had their robe choir, and they had, if you like, expository preaching, and it was part of the demand of the church. And they are wondering why the numbers were declining. And that's why they called me in. And when you started looking at it, they weren't prepared to change their patterns of liturgical worship. They weren't prepared to change the music. Their expectation that their minister be a chaplain rather than an evangelist. And when you talked about outreach, their response was, they know where to find us. When we talked about Bible teaching and relating to people, they were quite academic. They wanted to know the details of the scripture. They were very friendly to each other, but not so much to visitors. And their favourite saying was, we've always done it this way. And they wondered why their church was going down the track. They loved the pipe organ. And not many people love pipe organs. I'm the only one in Crib Point who likes pipe organ music, but they loved it. Nobody else did in the community. And they didn't, if you like, to be judgmental, they didn't understand the heart of the Father. The heart of the Father who wants us to be beyond our own inner circle. He wanted to I